So, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your family?
I was born Jean Marie Saint Amand. I was the fifth child of Barbara Gagner and Jim Saint Amand. I was born in Pontiac, Michigan, and grew up in Berkeley, Michigan.
And how many siblings do you have?
5. I was the youngest of 5.
All boys, all girls?
Nope, 2 boys, and then 2 girls, and then me.
Okay. So, how was it living in Detroit at this time?
It was great. Had a great childhood. Mom stayed at home. She was a domestic engineer. And Dad worked my whole life at Stroh's Brewery.
And what is Stroh's?
It's a Bohemian-style beer that was brewed in Detroit. So he worked downtown. We lived in the suburb.
And how far away was his job?
Probably less than a half an hour. I think Berkeley is probably 20 miles or so north of Detroit.
Did he drive to work or did he take public transit?
He drove. We had 1 car, and Dad took it. And so it was our kids' responsibility to make sure that the driveway was shoveled and all that kind of thing so that Dad could go to work every day.
And what kind of car was it?
Most of the time we had, Plymouth or Oldsmobile. We never had foreign cars. That's
Always
for sure.
American?
Always American. My dad was a Buick man.
Can you remember any of the really big changes? Detroit was a really bustling city back in the 60s and 70s. Can you remember any of the big things that were going on at that time?
Well, for sure it was an auto town. My dad worked for the brewery, but just about everyone else I knew worked for the Big Four, so one of the big auto making companies.
And what are the big four?
What is it? Ford, Chevy, which is GM, right?
I think so.
I don't know, what are they?
Chrysler?
Chrysler, yeah, for sure. And then I think it's Chevy and then GM. And GM covers other things. I don't know, that's a bad
Okay. But can you remember any of the big things that were happening in this time?
When I was a kid, like really young, I have real faint memories of the Detroit riots, which are quite historical. Studying it afterwards, I know that there was a lot of unrest with the minorities, with African Americans in Detroit, with housing and a lot of the civil rights things that was happening all over the country, and it definitely came to Detroit. And since my dad worked downtown, he was kind of right in the thick of it. The riots, what I remember is nighttime. I remember it being summer and all our windows being up, so you had the screens, and I can remember having blackouts. So it would be night during the summer, and we had to turn off all the lights. And even though we were, several miles away, I can remember my dad sitting on our screened front porch on our wood-sided house, and just kind of staying up most of the night. And I can remember him talking about how close the riots were coming, because what they did was they just sort of paraded right down the streets, because the cars weren't on the streets, so with torches and all kinds of stuff. So I don't remember ever being scared because I was little. I was probably 4 or 5, but I remember my dad being out there, kind of watching.
Was there ever any violence?
Not where I was. My dad, I can remember several times. This wasn't really the riots, but my dad was in a union. Detroit is definitely, back then, definitely was a union town, and my dad was in a union. And I can remember a couple times where my dad had to cross the union lines just so that he could work. He had 5 kids to feed.
And what does that mean, crossing the union lines?
Well, all his buddies and all his management and everybody were out there picketing because they were, wanting better conditions and more pay and that kind of thing. And it certainly lessens their cause if one of their own sides with management decides to go to work. Because that's basically what the picket does, right? They say, well, we're not going to work until we get our demands met. But Dad had to cross the line, and back then, if you crossed the line, you were really being threatened to get, beaten up or your tires slit or something like that. So I don't remember my dad ever suffering repercussions, but I don't know that my dad would have ever shared that with me. So.
And why do you think your dad wouldn't have shared that with you?
Well, I was a little kid. My dad was very old school, and it was his responsibility to take care of his family, and he was going to do what he needed to do. So.
Did your mom feel that she very much needed to fill the homemaker role?
Oh, yeah. She was the hostess with the mostest. She was Betty Crocker, and I don't think I had a store-bought cookie until I was in junior high. Went home for lunch every day during grade school, and my mom was a great homemaker.
Did all the other families in your neighborhood, were they very similar in structure to yours?
Yeah, growing up, like my elementary didn't even have a cafeteria. Everybody went home for lunch, and I remember there were a few kids that had working moms, like their moms were nurses or something like that, and they had to go to one classroom and brown bag it every day, and that always seemed kind of sad to me at the time. Just about everyone I knew, the moms stayed at home and the dads went to work.
Obviously, the civil rights was a big movement happening in Detroit around this time. Did you know anyone that was involved in civil rights, or was your family very separated from that?
Yes and no. My dad was big. My dad probably had the most contact with minorities altogether working downtown. My dad was a little bit like Archie Bunker. Does that mean anything to you?
No, sorry.
He was probably a bigot, but I think it was just a lack of education. Both my parents were very blue collar, had high school educations, but that kind of thing. What I remember most is probably more maybe early 70s, because my oldest brother, who's 12 years older than me, went to college. And I was like in first grade when he went to college. And he went to a very liberal arts college. He was going to be a social worker. So I can remember those conversations at the dinner table, and he came home and everything he owned was tie-dyed, and he was talking all this very social agenda, and my dad was just having a fit. My dad couldn't understand why he wasn't working on the line and, have a very traditional factory job. And my brother, it was, probably 1972, and my brother wanted to change the world. And so as just a little kid, I can just remember looking at him and thinking, oh, I want to go to college just like that, and I want to protest, and I want to do all that.
Since your parents were both very blue-collar, how did they push you in your education, or your brothers and sisters?
We were very, it was different. We didn't have all the testing and all the kind of stuff that you guys have. Certainly didn't have the internet. I was always a good student. I liked school a lot. And I think being the youngest and the women's movement happening during the 70s, subsequently my parents also got a divorce during the 70s. So I think my mom really pumped me full of that I could be anything I wanted to be. I think I knew probably from the time I was little that I was going to go to college. I was the only one after my oldest brother that went to school, but I think it was sort of expected of me being the youngest. So.
What was expected of you growing up as a little kid in the house?
As far as chores and stuff?
Yes.
While my mom was still at home, she didn't go to work until they got divorced. So not much. I didn't really do much. I don't think I made my bed until I was 10 years old or 12 years old. My mom, like I said, was this like super homemaker. But I loved to cook even back then, so I was always helping my mom in the kitchen. I loved being in the kitchen with my mom. My mom was always busy. I never remember her sitting down. If she was sitting down, she was on the phone with a cup of coffee and a cigarette in her hand and talking to her sisters or something like that. But if I got her in the kitchen, we would be singing and talking and stuff while we were cooking. So that was always a good time.
You said earlier that your oldest brother was a very forward thinker when compared to the values of your dad. What did both of them think of the Vietnam War?
Well, I remember my brother, he graduated high school in 1970 or 71. So there was a lot of worry that he would be drafted. It was sort of the end of Vietnam. And I can remember even them talking about, because we had lots of cousins in Canada. My dad was raised in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, which is just literally a stone's throw from Canada, and so we have a lot of our family that are French Canadian that live there. And I can remember hearing those conversations. I was a little kid, but but they didn't want my brother basically to live in hiding and all that kind of thing. And that was one of the things I think my dad thought as a consolation to my brother going to college. Not that college is a consolation. That sounds kind of funny, but that he would be less, up for the draft if he had been a college student. So
Did your parents have very strong political opinions?
they were definitely Democrats, and I think most of that was driven from their blue collar kind of heritage, and then also being Catholic. We were Catholic, and that had a lot to do with it, with Kennedy and all of that. So I think just kind of surroundings and kind of family history.
And how do you think that growing up in Detroit and being very much a part of this kind of typical American northern family has affected you now that you live in Texas?
Oh, I think it definitely still has. I don't think you kind of give up your roots very easily. It's hard having some of those values that I still have in Dallas, Texas. There's not too many people, I think, that think the way I do. So yeah, it's definitely a Midwestern kind of sensibility, I guess. So yeah.
When exactly did you move to Texas?
We moved, moved in 1982.
With your mom?
With my mom. My mom and I moved down. My mom, like I said, had been divorced for a few years, and her first grandchild, so my niece, was born, and they lived in Houston. And my mom knew that we could make a better life for ourselves here. Already people were leaving Michigan in droves.
And why was that?
The economy. The economy was really tanking. And if you think about the auto industry and everything that was going on, I mean, all of a sudden people were driving Nissans and all kinds of stuff on, so the whole economy was really shifting, especially in Detroit and lower Michigan. And so it was harder to get a job, and I think my mom knew that I would have a better future even. The thought of me going to college, I would probably go to a community college, and college wasn't even a given when I lived in Michigan. So definitely coming to Dallas is where we came was a better chance for me going to school.
And what was the hardest part or the biggest change coming from Michigan to Texas?
It's just the transition from Michigan to Texas. When I moved to Texas in 82.
How old were you?
I was almost 17. So I was starting my senior year of high school in a brand new place. And I pulled up to Pierce High School in Richardson, and there were limos, kids being dropped off by limos, and it was the era of big hair and full makeup. The girls used to get all dressed up with full makeup and everything, and I wasn't that way at all. I was an athlete in school, didn't wear makeup, didn't get dressed up to go to school, and so it was a big culture shock.
Okay, and one last question. What is one part of your childhood growing up in Detroit that you wish you could give to your children now?
Wow. I think probably extended family. I lived, my mom was from a big family, my dad was from a big family, so I probably had, within a half an hour, I probably had 25 cousins. We got together probably almost every single weekend because it was somebody's baptism or somebody's first communion, a wedding, whatever it is, and all holidays. So I was very close to cousins, aunts and uncles. So just the extended family.
All right, thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you.